Okay, well, we've made a whole bunch of videos talking about this one player on the San Jose Sharks, so if you need any insight as to what he is, his entire profile, and all the things that make him an attractive piece on the trade market, then there are weeks worth of material on this YouTube channel alone, just talking about him over and over and over again. But this is the first time we're making a video talking about this player and him being linked to these teams, and honestly, it's one that I'm kind of surprised to be making, because if you had asked me, okay, at the beginning of the year, and I say the year as in like 2023, not in the season, but at the beginning of the year, if you had asked me, who do you think are the teams that are going to enter the conversation for San Jose Sharks forward Timo Meier, the Red Wings and the Canadiens would not have been anywhere near the top of my list, the middle of my list, maybe even the consideration for the list. I didn't think these teams would be involved, but today we're talking about both the Habs and the Wings because we had ourselves David Pagnotta of the Fourth Period, who made himself an appearance on the Edgework podcast from 2 days ago. This is a show that is on YouTube, so I will leave a link in the description to their most recent episode. Trade deadline targets, Bo Horvat traded in the Kings goalie situation. If you go over to the 1640 mark of the podcast, you can see David Pagnotta on the show goes out there and talks about the Wings and the Habs. Now, the language he uses is very particular. He goes out there and talks about the Sharks and the Timo Meier situation, how Meier is a talented forward who is 26 years old, how the guy has a qualifying offer that is going to be huge. It's going to be $10 million for any team that wants to go out there and retain his rights. Of course, that team has to have his rights in the first place, but that's kind of how the qualifying offer process goes in the NHL. But because this is the status quo of a guy like Timo Meier, who this season has himself a pretty good point total, he's got 48 points in 51 games played, on pace for a career-high year in points and in goals, the Canadiens and the Wings are teams that, according to David Pagnotta, and this is all in the video, it's linked in the description, they've apparently knocked on the door, checking up and seeing what this player would cost. The reason Pagnotta provides for this is because with the cap certainty that is going to present itself with Timo Meier, should you acquire his rights and eventually hold on to him for the RFA negotiation period in the summer, there are teams that know roughly what he's going to cost, and they're not going to have to get into a bidding war with other teams because, I mean, if you have the guy's rights, that's all under your umbrella. He says that because this is the situation here, teams that are quote-unquote totally out of it, like Montreal and Detroit, who are checking in and knocking on that door regardless. Now, I don't want to go out there and approach this from a cynical point of view. I guess you could very well say, oh, look at Lego making a clickbait video again. But at the same time, I'd seen this pop up a lot all over my timeline. Canadiens fans starting the conversations about Timo Meier and whether or not he'd be a good fit for the Canadiens long term. And I just gotta say, when it comes to David Pagnotta and the thing that he said on the show, pretty much, I mean, there isn't really too much surprise behind that. Is there? Is there really? Like, the Canadiens are checking in on a guy that is on the trade market. Is that really that bad of a sin? I don't think so. I mean, it's Kent Hughes going out there and doing his due diligence because there's an opportunity to maybe see what other teams are willing to get rid of. And if the price aligns, if there's actually a good fit there, then why not go out there and explore the conversation as to what it would cost? Not because you're going to do it, but just because you want to get a frame of mind as to what it would be like. Same for Stevie Y. The guy is one of the most respected GMs in the entire NHL, and he's got that reputation for a reason. He's not afraid to go out there and turn over all the stones that are left face down. So when it comes to Meier and the Habs and the Wings, I definitely don't want to make it seem like this is, like, going to happen. It's not going to be a thing, seeing Timo Meier get traded to one of these two, but just bringing up the idea, hypothesizing, excuse me, why this could make sense if you really wanted to twist the knife in. Timo Meier is indeed 26 years old. He'll be 27 by the start of October, and we all know the contract situation. Because he's getting paid $10 million in actual salary this year, that qualifying offer is starting at $10 million, which is pretty steep for any team that's going to go out there and add that kind of contract onto their system. But when it comes to a player like Meier, I mean, he is smack dab in the middle of his prime. He is young enough that if you wanted to say, okay, we're starting to enter this competitive state, you know, my team is starting to contend for wildcard spots consistently. They'll squeak into the playoffs once in a while, and by this time, in let's say 2-3 years from now, they should have had at least 1 or 2 playoff rounds in their pocket as experience to play. And for a guy like Timo Meier, if you wanted to say that a top-of-the-line goal scorer, a guy who is on pace for 40-plus goals and 70-something points this season, is capable of sticking around in that sort of territory for the next few years, and okay, I mean, sign this guy for the amount of money that he's probably worth because he's in his prime and he's not slowing down. Meier is extraordinarily talented. It's just the San Jose Sharks in their own direction may not necessarily align with the trajectory that Timo Meier is appearing to go down because he's so good in the midst of this RFA negotiating year. So if you're Stevie Y or you're Kent Hughes, it's probably your best interest to go out there and do due diligence, see what the market is asking for with this guy, but I don't really see any sort of actual conversations coming out of it. Like, sure, they're knocking on the door seeing what's available, but I mean, if you see a trade with Timo Meier to the Habs, I don't really know if necessarily this is the right type of fit for Montreal. Like, I know we just said that Meier is young enough to justify adding to your team that is trying to make the wild card and maybe consistently compete over the next few years, but I don't think Montreal is necessarily that just yet. I feel like they're a little bit further back when it comes to the rebuilding process, quote-unquote, because there are so many players that we're expecting to get traded from this team soon. There are so many young guys that we're expecting to be big and important parts of this team heading into the next few years. And I just don't really see them being as far along as a team like Detroit, for example, who has a lot of NHL caliber talent on their roster right now that is signed for a while. They have young guys as well that are sort of maturing at their own rate. But really, I don't see the Wings as being a primary, like, huge seller off at this year's deadline, like you could see with the Montreal Canadiens. There are some names that could get shopped around, for sure, but, like, just looking at the quantity of guys that the Canadiens fans want to trade away for picks and everything, it's kind of different, I feel, the situations between both of these organizations. I know the points race goes out there and says that they're kind of in the same territory. They're sort of neck and neck at the bottom of the Atlantic right there, which isn't great, but at the end of the day, I don't know if Timo Meier necessarily fits in with the timeline of Montreal, more so than he fits in with the timeline of Detroit. If you really wanted to say, okay, Larkin, we've got an offer for you here. This team is going to be good, and you are going to be the leader that helps us define that success over the next 8 years. You'll come back to Detroit, you're 26, 27 years old, let's add on another 26, 27-year-old in Timo Meier, get you another line mate that can do extraordinary damage, that will replace Tyler Bertuzzi, and do all the things that you need to help this team remain competitive and force themselves into the playoff race sooner rather than later. The Wings have a little bit more, I feel, to give in the regular season, so if you wanted to justify a Timo Meier trade getting this guy for the purpose of making your team better in the short term, it would make more sense to me if it's Detroit rather than Montreal. But then again, you know, there still is the return that you have to go out there and talk about too. You're talking about prospects, you're talking about young guys, you're talking about picks. The Red Wings have had a very good time just doing their thing and not trading away many of those types of assets. Same thing could be said about the Montreal Canadiens. So, based off of what Pagnotta said on the podcast, it makes sense why these teams are checking in on Meier, but it doesn't make sense to me if they start to explore that type of a trade later on, and they come out as one of the top front runners for Timo Meier. I'd much rather leave him to get traded to the more desperate playoff teams that are already in playoff spots and contenders to get even more assets. If you're from the perspective of San Jose, you'd get more stuff trading with New Jersey, for example, than you would from Montreal or Detroit, because New Jersey just simply needs him more. Does that kind of make sense? So, thoughts in the comment section below about this idea. Timo Meier getting sent over to the Red Wings or the Canadiens, because they have both checked in on the guy via David Pagnotta on the Fourth Period on a podcast. There is an article in the description, or not an article, a link in the description that goes straight over to the YouTube video of the podcast. You can use the little timeline on the bottom of the screen to skim by and see where the segment is. But thoughts in the comment section below, either way, your thoughts about Meier, the Wings, and the Habs. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.